Usually when we talk about intelligence, we picture a very specific, almost clinical kind of process.
Right, like the traditional academic route.
Yeah, exactly. We imagine years spent hunched over textbooks or sitting in a quiet classroom, maybe joining a debate club. We tend to think of intelligence as something you actively choose to accumulate, just fact by fact over time.
Well, it's safe, it's quantifiable, and it's measured in degrees and test scores and performance reviews.
But then you step outside the classroom and you look at the world of developmental psychology and specifically early adversity. And suddenly that neat, comfortable definition just completely falls apart.
It really does, because you're looking at a cognitive landscape that is incredibly sharp. It's hyper observant and deeply analytical, but it wasn't built in a library.
No, not at all. It was built in the crucible of survival. And looking at it from that perspective entirely reframes what it actually means to be smart.
Yeah, it changes the whole paradigm.
Which is why today's deep dive is dedicated to a concept from a recent Psychology Insight breakdown that I think fundamentally changes how we view trauma. We are exploring the concept of traumatic intelligence.
It's such a fascinating topic.
It really is. So our mission today is to show you that if you've ever been told you're too sensitive or too intense, or that you overthink every single interaction, you might not just be dealing with symptoms of a past wound.
Right, you aren't just dealing with damage.
Exactly. You are likely operating with incredibly sophisticated cognitive and emotional adaptations.
And to really grasp this, we have to look under the hood at the biological hardware. We have to understand how early adversity literally changes the physical wiring of the human brain.
Okay, let's unpack this, because
Oh.
we aren't talking about magic here or some vague personality trait. We are talking about physical biology.
Yeah, real neuroscience. In developmental psychology, we see that children who grow up in unpredictable or emotionally complex environments have their brains wired early for one primary objective above all else.
Survival.
Spot on, survival. And two key players in the brain take on massive roles in this process: the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex.
Right. Okay.
So the amygdala is your brain's primal threat detector. It processes emotion, and it basically sounds the internal alarm when it perceives danger.
And the prefrontal cortex.
That's the analytical center. It
Yeah.
handles executive function, logic, and interpreting those alarms that the amygdala is sending out.
Wait, slow down for a second. So you're saying the analytical part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain are actually physically communicating differently in these individuals
Yeah.
compared to someone with a neurotypical calm background.
Yes, exactly. They form this unique hyperconnection. So in a safe childhood, the prefrontal cortex can easily tell the amygdala to just calm down. It can say, hey, it's just a loud noise, it's not a threat.
Right. It rationalizes the fear away.
But in a highly unpredictable environment, the brain simply can't afford to dismiss those alarms. It's too risky. So these two areas become intensely linked. It essentially turns the brain into a threat analysis supercomputer. It becomes wired to detect the most subtle, microscopic signals of danger. Signals that people from predictable backgrounds don't even have the receptors to see.
Which completely explains that quiet alertness you see in certain people.
Yeah.
Like the source breakdown talks about this as the first sign. Reading a room before anyone speaks.
Oh, absolutely. They can walk into a room and read the entire dynamic before a single word is spoken.
Yeah, they pick up on a millimeter of tension in a colleague's jaw or a micro expression that flashes across a friend's face for just a fraction of a second.
And the source material makes a great point here. This isn't some mystical intuition.
Right, it's not mind reading.
No, it is hyper-fast pattern recognition. It's based on an enormous database of emotional data they've been collecting their whole lives.
Because understanding unpredictable people wasn't just a hobby for these individuals.
Right, it wasn't a parlor trick to show off how empathetic they were. It was an absolute essential requirement for their well-being.
If a caregiver's subtle shift in mood dictated whether the evening was going to be peaceful or explosive, the child's brain, well, it had to learn to read the atmospheric pressure of the room instantly.
What's fascinating here is that it's an adaptation that never really shuts off.
It's almost like, and tell me if this analogy works, it's like running an aggressive, ultra-sensitive antivirus software in the background of your computer.
Oh, I love that analogy. Yeah.
It's scanning every single file, every incoming email, every line of code for a threat, 204/7. It's draining your battery, it takes up an immense amount of cognitive RAM, but it guarantees the system doesn't crash.
Because it spots the malware before it can execute.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that scanning software never really gets uninstalled, it just upgrades itself for adulthood.
Which brings us to the fourth sign mentioned in the insight, compulsively analyzing human behavior.
Yes. You see this manifest in how these individuals process conversations. They rarely just have an interaction and move on.
No, they replay it over and over. They compulsively dissect it. They replay the tone, the length of the pauses, the specific word choices.
They are constantly searching for the meaning behind the action.
Because they became students of human nature out of pure necessity. If you can understand the underlying why behind someone's behavior, you can anticipate their next move.
You map out their psychological profile so you are never caught off guard.
Exactly. But because the brain is spending so much energy tracking those microscopic shifts in tone or posture, that naturally bleeds into how this person experiences other people's feelings.
Right. The hyper-empathy, sign number 2.
Yes. They don't just notice the emotions, they end up absorbing them. The neural wiring we're talking about creates this profound hyper-empathy.
You become deeply attuned to the needs of the people around you, sometimes long before they're consciously aware of those needs themselves.
You notice the fatigue in a friend's voice, even when they have a smile plastered on their face and insist they're completely fine.
Right. The mirror neurons in the brain are just working in overdrive, reflecting the internal states of others.
You sense the shift in their energy because your baseline is set to monitor for fluctuations.
But hold on, I have to push back here,
Yeah.
because I think a lot of people listening might be wondering this.
Sure, what is it?
If someone's brain is constantly acting like a sponge, absorbing everyone else's emotional weather, and running that exhaustive background scan, wouldn't a chaotic high-stakes crisis just completely short-circuit the system?
You would think so.
I mean, how do they avoid a total breakdown from sensory and emotional overload when things actually fall apart?
It seems entirely contradictory, right? You'd expect the hyper-empath to just collapse in a crisis, but the opposite usually happens.
Which is sign number 3. Exceptional problem solving under pressure.
Exactly. When things fall apart, this person often goes remarkably calm and highly strategic. And we can explain this through a psychological concept from the source called stress inoculation.
Stress inoculation, like a vaccine, a literal biological inoculation against panic.
In a sense, yeah. Think about how a vaccine works. It introduces a small, manageable amount of a pathogen, so your immune system builds the antibodies to fight it.
Right.
Well, for someone with traumatic intelligence, high-stakes situations, chaos, and emotional unpredictability, that was simply their baseline normal during their critical developmental years.
Wow. So their body is just used to it.
Their neuroendocrinology, their levels of cortisol and adrenaline have been exposed to so much chronic stress that their nervous system is perfectly calibrated for a crisis.
So while a sudden disaster makes a neurotypical person's brain just flood with panic hormones because the situation is novel and terrifying.
The traumatically intelligent brain looks around the burning room and says, oh, I recognize this terrain. I know exactly how to navigate this.
The crisis doesn't overwhelm them because their biological hardware was quite literally designed for that exact environment.
Exactly. In a crisis, the rest of the world finally matches their internal state. They adapt rather than freeze.
Because the chaotic environment requires the exact analytical and emotional tools they've been carrying around their whole lives.
Spot on.
So we've been talking a lot about how these individuals handle the external world. Crises, reading other people's emotions, scanning the room. But I want to shift gears and look inward for a minute.
Okay, let's do it.
How does this biological adaptation shape their internal landscape? Because the source makes a very crucial point for sign number 5. These aren't broken pieces. These are highly evolved tools.
Yes. They are genuine cognitive and emotional adaptations. And when you turn those tools inward, the first thing you see, which is sign 6, is highly developed self-reliance.
Which makes sense. Developmentally, if the environment in your childhood wasn't reliably supportive.
Or if the adults around you couldn't be trusted to regulate their own emotions, let alone yours.
Right. The brain quickly learns to internalize resourcefulness. Depending on others feels entirely too risky, so absolute competence becomes the default state.
You don't wait for people to rescue you. You build the solutions independently.
It's a brilliant survival strategy, really, but it is heavily disguised as independence.
It is. And it also alters the emotional frequency they operate on, which is the 7th sign. We discussed the amygdala earlier. the emotional processing center.
Right, the threat detector.
Well, because it has been highly sensitized through repeated early activation, the threshold for emotional processing is lowered. The highs are higher and the lows are lower.
They feel things at a completely different frequency.
They really do. The source points out that music hits differently. Injustice bothers them on a visceral, almost physical level.
Yeah, even just a small, kind gesture from a stranger at the grocery store can genuinely move them to tears. They don't just observe the world, they feel it in high definition.
Which creates a really complex dilemma for relationships. Think about it. If you feel things that intensely, and your brain has learned that depending on people is dangerous, how do you handle connection?
Oh man, that leads perfectly into sign number 8, adaptive skepticism.
Exactly. It's often mislabeled as cynicism, but they are very different things.
Because cynicism is a blanket belief that people are fundamentally bad.
Right.
Yes.
But adaptive skepticism is a highly calibrated protective response.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Your brain learned early on that not all signals of safety are genuine.
Because sometimes a calm voice hides a volatile temper.
Exactly. Sometimes the smile is just a mask. So your brain built heavy-duty filters. It's like having a highly rigorous bouncer working the door of an exclusive club.
I like that. A bouncer.
The bouncer isn't mean, but they are incredibly thorough. They're checking IDs, they're cross-referencing the guest list, they're scanning the vibe. Most people simply aren't getting past the velvet rope.
On a neurological level, what's happening is the brain is delaying the release of oxytocin, the bonding hormone, until it has fully verified that the person is safe.
The nervous system is demanding proofs before it allows vulnerability.
Yes. But the beauty of that adaptive skepticism is what happens when someone actually does pass the test.
Once the bouncer finally lets someone in.
Exactly. Once they're in, the connection that forms is profound. It's honest, it's meaningful, and it is unusually resilient.
Because that person didn't just stumble into your life. They earned their place there. Your nervous system has fully verified them.
Those filters guarantee a level of depth in the relationships that do form. They protect the system from shallow, potentially harmful connections.
So, okay, we have a brain that is built to thrive in chaos. It's constantly filtering for threats. It's hyper-analyzing behavior, maintaining intense self-reliance, and carefully gating its emotional connections.
Right.
But what happens when the environment is finally safe? What happens on a random Tuesday when the bills are paid, the house is quiet, and there is absolutely no crisis to manage?
Well, that introduces the paradox of peace, which is the 9th sign. For someone with traumatic intelligence, slowing down and resting can feel incredibly uncomfortable.
It almost feels physically unsafe, doesn't it?
It does. Because if the antivirus software stops scanning, the virus gets in. If you lower your guard to relax, you are vulnerable to an ambush.
Biologically, when you are used to operating on high levels of adrenaline and cortisol, a sudden drop in those hormones doesn't feel like relaxation.
No, it feels like an eerie silence before a storm. The nervous system is doing what it was conditioned to do, stay alert.
So when things get too quiet, the mind tends to wander inward. And usually, it's looking for the hidden danger it assumes must be there.
Which is the ultimate irony. The very intelligence that trauma built requires active effort to unwind.
So what does this actually mean for you, the listener, who is recognizing yourself in this exact dynamic?
Yeah.
How do you ever actually find peace if your own brain views rest as a literal threat to your survival?
It's a huge question.
Are you just doomed to be exhausted forever?
No, but finding peace requires a fundamental shift in perspective. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it requires a lot of active neuroplasticity. Learning to rest, for someone with traumatic intelligence, isn't a passive activity like, taking a nap or going to a spa.
It's not just chilling out.
Not at all. It is an act of reclaiming. It is a conscious, active, and profoundly difficult process of telling your nervous system, over and over again, that the threat has finally passed.
Peace is work. It's the active retraining of the amygdala.
It is deeply demanding work. But that work leads to the 10th sign and perhaps the most defining characteristic of traumatic intelligence, an unshakable sense of meaning.
People who have navigated this terrain do not move through life casually.
They really don't. They've looked incredibly closely at pain, their own and others, and something foundational inside them refuses to let that pain be meaningless.
They forge meaning out of the fire.
Exactly. In the psychological literature, there is a fascinating concept known as post-traumatic growth. It was studied extensively by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun.
Post-traumatic growth. We hear a lot about resilience, right?
We do, but resilience is the ability to bounce back to where you were before a hardship. Post-traumatic growth is different. It is a fundamental restructuring of one's worldview.
It's not bouncing back, it's bouncing forward.
Precisely. Tedeschi and Calhoun found that a significant portion of people who navigate severe adversity emerge with profound philosophical clarity.
The trauma shatters their previous understanding of the world. And in the rebuilding process, they develop a deeply nuanced perspective on what actually matters in life.
Yes. They experience richer relationships, a greater appreciation for life, and they learn wisdom far earlier than most of their peers.
They didn't just survive the crucible, they translated their survival into a deeply rooted philosophy.
They become the people who can hold space for the darkest parts of the human experience without flinching, because they've already mapped the territory.
It is the ultimate synthesis of all the traits we've discussed today. The hyper-perceptiveness, the empathy, the stress inoculation, the self-reliance. They all culminate in this profound drive to live a life of purpose and authenticity.
Which is incredibly powerful.
It is. Which brings us to a critical synthesis of this entire deep dive. We've gone through the underlying neuroscience, the intensely sensitized amygdala, the hyper-empathy, the struggle with peace, and the eventual post-traumatic growth.
It's a lot to take in.
And taking all of this from the source material leaves us with a very delicate balance to strike.
Yeah, we have to be careful not to romanticize trauma.
Right.
Traumatic intelligence is a marvel of human adaptation, but it should never be celebrated at the expense of acknowledging the deep, often unfair difficulty that created it.
The sharpness is incredibly real, but so is the cost. The exhaustion of constantly running that mental antivirus software. The loneliness that can accompany adaptive skepticism. The physiological inability to easily rest.
Those are very real tolls on the body and the mind.
These 10 signs we've explored, they are the architecture of a mind that had to grow quickly to survive. And it did.
And validating the transformation doesn't mean dismissing the pain. It means recognizing that the human brain wasn't just damaged by hardship. It was remarkably profoundly transformed by it.
And that leaves us with a deeply empowering final thought for you, the listener. The source material points out that the question is no longer how you got here. The past is written, the adaptations are installed in your hardware.
The question now is what you choose to do with this profound intelligence you built along the way.
Exactly. So we want to leave you with a thought to mull over that pushes beyond just self-acceptance. We live in a society that primarily rewards academic, quantifiable intelligence, the kind built in safe, quiet classrooms.
Sure.
But imagine if society placed equal value on the intelligence built in the crucible. What if corporate boards, community organizations, and leadership structures actively sought out the hyper-empathy, the crisis navigation, and the profound meaning-making of traumatic intelligence?
You would change everything.
It really would. If you begin to view your heightened sensitivity, your empathy, and your ability to read the unseen, not as a scar to be hidden, but as a hard-won, highly specialized instrument.
What could you accomplish?
Right. What new, meaningful rooms might you choose to walk into and read? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you feel seen, validated, and armed with a brand new psychological framework for understanding the absolute brilliance of your own mind. Take care of yourselves, and we'll catch you next time.